The quarterback trade carousel is off and running, and now it gives us a different perspective on what exactly Kirk Cousins' trade value is. So let's look at what's going on, dive in, and figure it out here on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
Ooh-wee! You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL, shows on Twitter at Locked On Vikings, and thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. And today on the show, I've sort of deferred the, what does Kirk Cousins get in a trade for a while. And I guess we've got a lot of information now. It's such a weird market and there's a lot of economics to it that are hard to describe. So I'm going to kind of spend a whole show trying to discern what exactly you would get in a Kirk Cousins trade and make a prediction there. Because if you're still on the fence and you don't know, most people have chosen their side. If you are still trying to engage with the question, is it better to trade Kirk Cousins or extend him? A big part is, what do you get in return, right? Some people will say Kirk Cousins, you'll need to give Kirk Cousins and draft picks just to get someone to take that terrible, terrible contract. I think we've proven kind of ad nauseum in the last week that contract ain't that bad. Some people are happy to get anything in return. Some people will only do it if we get a first round pick or 2 first round picks, only if we get what they got for Matt Stafford. And some people don't want to trade him at all. So look, if the price turns out, hey, you can trade Kirk Cousins away and they'll take the whole contract, but you only get a 4th round pick back, that feels a lot different. So let's figure out exactly what we're working with here. If you do trade Kirk Cousins, what does that look like? And to start that conversation, I guess let's talk a little bit of NFL news, because Russell Wilson just got traded to the Broncos. That happened on Tuesday. And, that's a big one, and the haul was insane. Now, look, Russell Wilson is not Kirk Cousins. We'll get into how we can kind of align that comparison and adjust for how different those two people are. But 2 first-round picks, 2 second-round picks, 3 veteran players, 3, I'm going to call them starters, even though Drew Lock is probably more of a backup. A backup quarterback, value-wise, is closer to a starting defensive player or whatever. And I think a 4th and 5th round swap, that doesn't really matter. So that is a lot. That's a huge haul for Russell Wilson. Now, Russell Wilson ain't Kirk Cousins, right? There's a lot of differences here. And what I really want to talk about in this show is the difference in economics here. There is a market, and the quarterback market is very, very unique. This is not the market for strawberries where there's a supply and there's a demand. Because the supply, usually the amount of quarterbacks available for trade, is never going to be more than 3. And sometimes it goes down, a lot of that market was set by Aaron Rodgers deciding to go back to Green Bay, which also is a thing that was, I don't know, kind of felt like it was always going to happen, but it was pretty much confirmed on Tuesday by Rodgers himself. So that domino kind of makes it, okay, now Russell Wilson is the only, call him quote unquote elite quarterback on the market, the only quarterback that the Broncos could trade for that made them feel like they'd be a contender, right? I don't know if anybody else, unless you're higher on Kirk Cousins than I am, in which case, fair enough. So that meant that Russell Wilson, sort of in a tier of his own among quarterbacks that are available for trade, and we only know who is available for trade, but Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr, Jimmy Garoppolo, I'll put these guys all in one tier, and then Russell Wilson, seen in league-wide, as a tier above. So he is the only guy. And so Seattle can jack up the price and say, pay this or you don't get anything. And the Broncos kind of have to do it. I still think that's a better deal for the Broncos than it is for the Seahawks, to be honest. It seems like fair compensation. And a big reason for that, and a big thing changing the market economics here, is also the contract. Russell Wilson will now play for Denver on cap hits of, I think, $23 million and $27 million. That's really low for a quarterback, especially for a good quarterback. That is, you've got an advantage over just about everybody who isn't paying their quarterback a rookie contract. And all of those situations are fleeting, right? Because after 3 years, that guy's going to start wanting an extension. So yeah, that's really, really, really jacking up the value of Russell Wilson as an asset. So when you think of trading a quarterback and really any player, you're not necessarily trading like Kirk Cousins, if he gets traded, isn't going to get that kind of haul. I think we all know that. But that's not necessarily because Kirk Cousins is that much worse of a quarterback than Russell Wilson. Like, I think he is worse than Russell Wilson, but I don't think by the degree, I don't think he's half as good as Russell Wilson. Therefore, he deserves half the compensation, and that would be high, right? But more of it is the economics. If you want to say no to the Vikings, you can turn around and maybe get Derek Carr from the Raiders or get Jimmy Garoppolo from the 49ers and feel like you had a reasonably similar quarterback. I think most people agree that those guys are kind of always lumped together in the same tier. So because that leverage element doesn't necessarily exist, you can't jack up the price the way the Seahawks could. The other thing is Kirk's contract is different. Now, again, it's not a deal breaker. We're not Osweilering this, but it does depress the value some. You'll go from, 2 firsts, 2 seconds, and 3 players. That's going to depress a lot when you're on $35 million fully guaranteed in base salary, which is what a team would pick up. $10 million would stay with the Vikings no matter what. So think of Kirk Cousins, $35 million quarterback 1 year. So you basically have to sign him to an extension immediately. And that means the actual package of Kirk Cousins that you're getting is probably going to be closer to $40 million a year because of the way the quarterback market is shaping up. So whoever is trading for Kirk Cousins is trading for an expensive quarterback. And this is where it gets to the point where I have to do the rant again about value and resources, because there are 2 different kinds of currency in the NFL and both of them matter. And I think we get really confused when we forget that one exists. And you go, my goodness, they have spent so much draft capital on this position. And you look and they haven't spent a dime on it. That we did that with offensive line for a long time ago. My goodness, Rick Spielman didn't spend anything on the offensive line. They've got the cheapest offensive line in the league. And then you look and they've spent the most draft capital on it. And it's like, they've just spent a different kind of resource. So once you lump together what the resources are, then it's just a matter of, we're just exchanging pounds for dollars. And we'll talk a little bit about the economics of that too. And there's some other trades we can use to figure out what the exchange rate is, if you will. And we're going to kind of get deep into that too, to really try to hash out what we think Kirk Cousins should be. So we'll talk about that. First things first, though, let me talk to you about a good old Gramble. If you're an NFL player, please turn the podcast off now. Don't do that. But if you're not an NFL player, then you can go ahead and Gramble. You can go to Bet Online. It's your one-stop shop for all things gambling. All sorts of news, odds, and scores. You can bet on upcoming basketball tournaments. Selection Sundays this Sunday for the men's tournament. Gonzaga women's just won their conference. I think they might be a force. You can go bet on all that stuff, and they usually have fun bracket challenges and stuff too. So head on over to betonline.net. You can use their player props builder to build all the weird parlays I know y'all like to do. You can bet on pro basketball, hockey, Vegas. You can even play your favorite Vegas casino games. So head on over to betonline.net and get yourself a Grambling. Bet Online, where the game starts. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by multiple currencies. So there's cap space, there's dollars, money to spend. But that's a finite resource that you have to allocate wisely and try to get the most bang for your buck possible, right? You're trying to fit the most talent you possibly can under the salary cap. That's the whole game of it. And then there's draft picks, which is also a finite resource. A lot of trades that don't make sense or behaviors that don't make sense to you might make sense if you consider the other currency. And this is going to be a big thing when it comes to what a Kirk Cousins trade value would be. Let us pretend for a moment that Kirk Cousins and Russell Wilson are the exact same caliber of quarterback. I don't agree with it, but it makes the math easy. So let's go with it. Kirk Cousins would still garner way less than Russell Wilson did. But Russell Wilson's trade can give us a sense of where the quarterback market is at right now. Because he doesn't have to be extended, he gives us a nice clean palette of what is a quarterback on a good deal worth? And look, it's worth a lot. Surprise, surprise. So a quarterback on a bad deal, or on a deal that will have to become bad, is going to be harder to talk a team into, and therefore it's going to be harder to get a lot of draft picks. A team is going to be a little bit more hesitant to spend a bunch of draft capital and a bunch of cap space on a player. You don't want to double up. You don't want to double play. There are certain cases where, like, I think of like the Seattle Jamal Adams trade, where they spend 2 first-round picks and then they have to extend him, although that wasn't immediate. So I think that might have been Seattle's mistake, is that they didn't look far enough in the future there, where they spent 2 first-round picks, and then that kind of necessitates that they extended him, and then it turned into a lot of draft capital and a lot of money, and then it turns into this big overpay, and now everybody in Seattle hates it. And I think when it comes to evaluating what the Vikings have spent on Kirk Cousins, that the cap numbers look really scary because they didn't spend any draft picks on him. And that kind of justifies it a little bit more. I do think it's still an overpay in spite of that, but it's like, it helps, right? Like it's part of contextualizing what this is. So, okay, we understand that that works, right? We understand that there's an economics here. There is also a sort of a sense of urgency when it comes to quarterback that I think affects this dynamic a lot. Let's say, again, Kirk Cousins, Derek Carr, Jimmy Garoppolo, let's call them all same-ish. Even if you don't agree, just do it to make the math easy. And then say that there's 5, 6 maybe teams that are in desperate need of a quarterback. And there kind of are, right? Tampa Bay is going in with Kyle Trask. The Saints are in a lot of trouble. The Panthers are in a lot of trouble. Pittsburgh just lost Ben Roethlisberger. There's the Commanders. There's the Giants. There's 6 right off the bat, and I'm pretty sure I'm missing people. So 6 teams, and let's say those are the 3 quarterbacks available for trade, and then you have to start talking yourself into like Mitch Trubisky. Which I guess teams are doing. That means that there is a certain scarcity. There's only 3 quarterbacks and 6 teams. Now, let's say, Derek Carr re-signs with Vegas, and let's say, one of those teams trades for Jimmy Garoppolo. So the Commanders trade for Jimmy Garoppolo. They're out of the running. Now you got 5 teams and 1 Kirk Cousins. Suddenly Kirk Cousins is looking a lot better than when you got to look back at your own roster and it's like, oh no, all we have is Ian Book. That's a problem. So that means that there might be a time, if the Vikings can time this right and really hold on to their negotiations well, there would be a time when Kirk Cousins' value is maximized because there's going to be more than one team that needs a quarterback desperately enough that an inarguably starting quality quarterback in Kirk Cousins, like, he's going to be the only one you can get if everybody else's situation gets resolved before his does. And then suddenly the market's going to have to bid against him. And it becomes trade for Kirk Cousins or die. And that's a situation where, look at the healthcare industry, all right? People are going to pay a lot when it's do this or die. So we're going to talk about exactly now. I'm going to stop beating around the bush and get into actual amounts here. But I really wanted to explain the economics of that of a quarterback trade market and why the numbers are going to feel so different when it comes to trading for Derek Carr versus Cousins versus Wilson versus why Drew Lock was just a throw in, and then maybe why Sam Darnold will seem the same and all that. And it'll all be very strange with how quarterbacks are. But a lot of that is situation and economics and the way leverage happens to be in that exact moment and timing. There's a lot going on with it. But I do want to actually come up with a final take here, which I don't even have at this point. So we're going to talk it out live. There's a few recent-ish trades that I really want to emphasize here. And the first one I want to talk about is the Matt Stafford trade with the Rams. And I'm thinking of like a parallel, like a Sam Darnold, Kirk Cousins trade with the Panthers, right? Where you have Kirk Cousins, who's at least a reasonable quarterback, maybe more if you're into him, but he's at least like going to be top half, right? And then Sam Darnold, who is just never going to be, he's a disaster. Very similar to Stafford and Goff. And that was a really interesting one that isn't a perfect allegory, but we can edit it. Like, for one, Jared Goff was on a terrible contract. It was 2 years left on that contract, a ton of guaranteed money, no way out of it. And it was very clear that he's like bad. Like, Kirk Cousins is a lot harder to evaluate than Jared Goff. Like, he is bad, and they needed to get out of it. So the Rams had to give up an extra first-round pick to get rid of the Jared Goff contract. So the compensation there ended up being Matt Stafford going to the Rams, and then it was like 2 firsts and a third. And so it looked like Matt Stafford got traded for 2 first-round picks, but if you're thinking, well, then Kirk Cousins can get traded for 2 first-round picks. In order to do that, you also have to say, and we'll take on your albatross contract. Sam Darnold isn't on that kind of contract. It's not a great but it's not something like the kind of albatross that Jared Goff was. But we can edit around that, because what the contract dump portion of the Goff Stafford trade was a first round pick, and you take the contract. So I'll give you a first round pick to get this off my hands. And then it was a first and a third for actual Stafford. So if Kirk Cousins is the same thing as Matt Stafford, I'm not saying he is, but if he were, it would be Kirk Cousins for a first and a third. But again, the Stafford cap hit, I think, was like 21 million or something when the Rams played this year, and they were able to win a Super Bowl with that. 35 is a lot more. And again, he's going to need an extension, and that extension is going to be huge. So you kind of never get him for that cheap year where the other team is paying a whole bunch of signing bonus dead cap, and you just get to pay his little base salary that wasn't meant to be the whole contract, but it is for you. Kind of the deal that the Bills are dealing with Diggs, because that's something that happened to us in that trade. So what's $10 million worth? If you look at Jared Goff as a zero asset, as a not worthy asset with no value to him, which I don't think is true of the Lions. I do not think Brad Holmes, who drafted Goff in St. Louis when they were in St. Louis, that I don't think that they view him that way. But if you were to do that, you could kind of say, okay, they paid a first round pick to get rid of this much salary cap. Or the original one was Brock Osweiler. The Texans paid a second round pick to get rid of a $17 million contract, which back then was huge. And if you really wanted to, you could look at all those sorts of trades where the value's kind of messed up until you look at the contract, and really figure out. I think Justice Mosqueda has done something like that. But for now, I think each 10 million, you're taking it down around. And I think that's probably fair. But in the interest of like guesstimating, I think like if Stafford was worth a first and a third at 21 million, Kirk Cousins at 35, and you got to add to it, is probably like half that. And that is, again, it's just an exchange of currency, because instead of getting all draft picks back, we're getting draft picks and money back. The the Lions didn't get as much money back from the Matt Stafford trade. They ate a dead cap hit. We would eat less of a dead cap hit, I believe, or at least proportionately so. So we're getting still some resources back, just a different kind of resource. So I say if you just traded Kirk Cousins straight up, I think a second round pick is pretty close. If you think about Matt Stafford as a first and a third, you take the third out, you bump the first down to a second, and say that's how we compensate for the money being that much more. And you have to also agree that they're about the same caliber of quarterback, which is probably a tougher sell coming off of Matt Stafford winning a Super Bowl. But I digress. To make the math easy, if you think Kirk Cousins is better or worse, then adjust accordingly and do it your own way. So that's, I guess, where I'm going to land, is if you just go, here you go, Kirk Cousins to the Saints, second round pick in return, that's it. If you wanted to add other things into it, like Kirk Cousins to the Panthers, that's a Sam Darnold trade. Now we're getting somewhere, where they have to unload a Sam Darnold contract onto us, assume that Sam Darnold is not seen as an asset that's like worth something. That might actually up the ante. You have, Kirk Cousins goes to Carolina and Sam Darnold and a first comes back. That would be the kind of thing that I anticipate there. But I think for most situations, like the Bucs, the Saints, the Steelers, it would be something like Kirk for a second, and then for somebody like maybe the Panthers or the Browns, it'd be a little more complicated, because I do think Baker Mayfield's like a much better quarterback than Darnold. And I do think he would probably take away from the draft compensation versus add to it, like I think Darnold would. So a Kirk for Baker Mayfield trade, I think, would be closer to straight up. It would be like Baker Mayfield and a third comes back, something like that. And again, keep in mind that we're saving a ton of money by doing that. And so instead of draft picks coming back, you can think of it as money coming back. And that would be the way a trade works. So this ain't a blockbuster. Trading Kirk Cousins is not a shot in the arm to your rebuild like trading Russell Wilson was for the Seattle Seahawks. It's more about getting out from under the albatross. If you're like me and you think Kirk Cousins can't win a Super Bowl in Minnesota, and you just want to get away from that situation, that it's more about that. And so for me, It's more about getting rid of that contract. It's malleable, it's workable, but the only way to work it is to commit more to Kirk Cousins, and I don't want to do that. So I want to get out of this marriage with Kirk Cousins, and to do that, trade him away. Give me a second, give me a third. I'm good with all of it. But I think all in all, and I'll wrap with this, it's a lot more about being willing to trade Kirk Cousins than it is about needing to get the right price. Because like I mentioned in the beginning, if you time it right and you wait for everybody else's quarterback situations to get solved, and then you round up whatever the stragglers are who are sitting there going like, do I have to talk myself into Mason Rudolph? And you call them up and say, Kirk Cousins on the block. I've got you, I've got Tampa, I've got the Panthers or whoever on the board, on the horn here. You guys bid against each other, Kirk to the highest bidder. And if you do that, you're going to get good value. It's just economics. It's just the way it works. 3 teams are going to bid against each other. They're all going to feel really desperate and bad. And especially franchises like Pittsburgh or New Orleans that don't really want to be a part of a tank team. A Kirk Cousins trade can look a lot better to those teams versus somebody like Seattle that's very clearly ready to hit the reset button and maybe go into a rebuild. You can get that value. And it's a matter of, do you want to get rid of Kirk Cousins? And that's kind of why I've framed the conversation that way this whole offseason and made it so that, like, no, it's not about getting someone to take the contract. It's not about, well, we'll trade him if the price is right. No, it's, do you want to get rid of him or don't you? And if you do, there's a way to do it. We talked about that on Monday. If you do want to keep him, and if you don't want to keep him, then we're going to talk about that either tomorrow or Friday. So that's kind of going to be what the rest of the week is the mock off-season plan for if you get rid of Kirk Cousins, how do you start the rebuild? And I'm going to kind of simulate that. And then depending on what happens here in the next few days, we'll see kind of where things end up. Obviously, if there's news, we'll handle that as well. In the meantime, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast. Get yourself primed for all of that stuff. I will see you all tomorrow, and as always, Skol.